Very good. Welcome. I'm Dr. Paul VanValin. I'm a clinical psychologist and founder of Eden Counseling and Consulting and Eden Leaders Institute. This is one of a number of programs we've been running for about 18 months, pretty faithfully, doing one per month. We've covered topics that pertain to people with counseling roles, premarital counseling, marriage counseling. We've covered various aspects of relationship issues that would apply to anybody, focusing particularly on the role of leaders in various institutions, a lot of pastoral and clergy references, given my background and the people I hang out with a lot. So today we're talking about critical stress. Last month we did a program dealing with common stress. But critical stress has a particularly intense effect on people. And as you'll see, it's very common. Everybody at some time in their life is going to go through a critical experience. And toward that end, I have advanced training from the Critical Incident Stress Management Foundation. It was founded probably about 20 years ago. And they provide extensive training worldwide in how to lead people through critical incident stress. And most of the people trained are not mental health professionals, nor necessarily professionals in any direct human service. Most people who are trained in critical incident stress management are military and paramilitary individuals, and they're peer leaders. They don't call them counselors. It's not counseling. It's a process, and I'll introduce you to that today. The scope is limited. I mean, we have an hour, so I can't. I had 2 days of introductory training for the beginner level and then 5 days of training for the advanced level. Can't do that in an hour. But I think you'll feel that you get a bit of a good overview here as we move through this. Our institute exists to develop healthy leaders. And toward that end, the third Thursday of the month is when we do this program from 12 to 1 Eastern Time. And if you want to go online and catch up with us, you can look up my name in YouTube and find links to previously recorded programs, as well as programs we have on our website. EdenLeaders.com is still being developed, so it's EdenCounseling.com to look at some previous training. The objectives of this class are that you will understand this term and concept and what it does and what it means, and that you will, we're not going to do a formal evaluation, but I think just participating in this program, each of us will be considering events that we have experienced, how it's affected us. And you will have some strategies by the time we're done. We created some very simple, effective models to take up to New York after the 9/11 incident. We're able to quickly train people in this, and so you're going to get an overview of that as well. And some of these things you'll connect with right away and can make use of them. I wanted us to begin with a little video that probably in 4 minutes does a better job of describing the realities of what takes in the brain with chronic stress. So this video isn't talking necessarily about critical stress, but as you can imagine, if you've been through a flood of significant size, or an earthquake, or war, the stress can be chronic. And so to help us really appreciate that this is a very real thing. Stress is a very real health issue. And so we're going to watch this video together. And as we do, I will have to exit this screen and enter another, and we'll watch this together for about 4 minutes.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst.
I'm going to pause this because I realize I have a camera on. So give me just a second. Okay, I apologize. I'm going to actually back it up because that was a bit distracting. Let's try again.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all, though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news, though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
So, a lot of information in 4 minutes, but what I wanted you to get out of it was the reality that there are physiological changes that stress creates, and the body has been God equipped the body to be able to manage things. Um, for example, he mentions cortisol, which is necessary. That's part of the arousal system, part of the alert system. But if it's on too long, it causes problems, which is true about anything else in life. You know, a bite of chocolate is a really good thing. Too much chocolate is a bad thing. So it's a matter of amount and timing of these things. And so, just a bit of review from last training. You know, we call stress the response to stressors or events that cause stress. Today we're talking about critical stress, and it adds up. It's cumulative. A metaphor that I use often to help illustrate the effect of ongoing stress is to imagine in my right hand there's just a glowing ball of energy. And it has all the energy that exists in my system. There's my spiritual energy, physical energy, emotional energy, and relational energy. And every breath I take takes a little bit away. Every thought I think takes a little bit away. So it has to be replenished, has to go into recovery, be nurtured so that it remains full of the resources that I need to live. In my left hand, I have a bowl, and this bowl is designed to contain all the stresses that drip, liquid metaphor, drip into this bowl or pour into this bowl, or in terms of critical stress, fire hose pour into the bowl. And the goal is to have the little spigot on and off enough to keep the stress levels low, because when it overflows, then wherever our frailties are, wherever our weaknesses are, that's what comes out. We lapse back into coping in ways that may not be particularly productive. We may develop physical illnesses, emotional stresses, may affect our spirituality, our relationships. So we want to keep that stress bowl with lots of space to take in whatever is coming next. We want to keep that glowing ball of energy full and rich so that we can handle life. So stressed out is when I still have energy, but it's sort of overwhelming me, and I need to figure out how to get that stress in a better volume relative to the rest of my life. Burned out is when the stress bowl is overflowing and I've got nothing over here in the ball of energy. And so another way of looking at these two concepts of stressed out and burned out, I'll show you in a second. But recovery is critical, and we have this evidence that God actually rested after a period of work, and failure to have recovery time is really the issue here. So stressed out is, I have a friend, Gary Sweeten, his metaphor is, if a car's out of gas, that's like being stressed out. If you just pour a little in the tank, you're off and running. So that pouring in a little tank will be different for different people, taking a week off, a little recreation, getting together with friends. Burned out, however, is like a car engine running out of oil. And for those of you that understand simple mechanics, that means that it overheats and it actually melts large portions sometimes of the engine itself. It's ruined. It requires major recovery, either putting in a rebuilt or a new engine in most cases. And so back to humans, when we are burned out, the recovery is longer. We might need specialists to help us. We might have become physically or emotionally, mentally ill. And there's almost always some residual damage. Those of you that have a car, that is, even if you swap out a part for a good part, it's not quite the same as when it was new. And so the effect on our lives with both chronic normal stress or intense critical stress is that we are changed in the process, sometimes in good ways. And that's part of the message I want us to be able to lead with is hopefulness. Going back to the video, we saw that a non-nurturing mother rat produced offspring less able to deal with stress. But you can swap the mother figure and the child develops normally, and it affects the genetic predisposition for future generations. And that always reminds me, when I hear these things, I'm reminded that the wrath of God is directed to the third and fourth generation for the sins of the fathers, but the blessings to 1,000 generations. And so that little graph showing one restored young rat having offspring is multiple generations. And the way we lead and the way we teach and the way we help people through these things has huge impact on their future and their future of their generations that follow them. The Bible has lots of examples of critical stress. At the individual level, loss of a child, murder. At a community level, flood. We got Noah, and that was at a regional level. We have David and Goliath. We have all kinds of domestic violence, including rape, incestuous rape, terrible things. And the Bible simply captures these things as evidence of the nature of man versus the nature of how God wants man to be. And those things continue to this day. These are the things today that continue to be critical stress incidents that can alter a person's perspective, their health, and the trajectory of their life if we don't help people with this. So the Bible has lots of good leader examples, also bad leader examples. So I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. That's that sacrificial agape, that agape into action when we are doing things for those that we are leading. The hired hand is not the shepherd. It does not own the sheep. He's less invested. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. And so we know that the life of a shepherd was sometimes dangerous. David talks about killing a bear, killing a lion. Here's an example of a wolf. And so the leader that is prepared, well-equipped, confident, can lead rather than see the flock scattered. And that's our goal. Because when the flock scatters, they become prey to all kinds of situations. But if they stay together, there's strength in numbers. So critical stress can be at the individual level, the community level, the national level, and the international level. And the bigger it is, the worse it is for the individual and for the community. If an individual has a problem, then there are hopefully loving people to help and care. They can have access to basic stuff of life. But as that gets bigger and bigger, there become fewer resources. It was really striking. I had the privilege of going up to New York City probably 12 times myself. We sent 20 groups after September 11 of 2001. So in 2001, 2002, we sent up 20 teams, and I was personally involved in 12. And it was astounding. New York is the center of commerce and in some ways international politics, given what takes place there. And they recovered amazingly. A year later, there was no sign of anything had happened except for what they call ground zero, the place where the buildings were gone. And now, if you go back, they've erected the tower. There's a museum there. Last time I was there, still some evidence that it happened, but by summer, if you didn't know the story, you wouldn't think that anything had happened in New York. By contrast, New Orleans, several years later, 2005, a large-scale, broad, intense hurricane comes through, Katrina, wipes out large masses of land through residual flooding. Actually was the biggest problem in New Orleans. And so I was there a number of months after the initial hurricane and saw the devastation firsthand, miles and miles and miles of uninhabited dwellings, businesses. And then I was there a year later and a year later, and 2 years later you still saw miles and miles and miles of uninhabitable dwellings, some of which had people living in them, which wasn't good. But and the reason there, whereas New York City is a rich city, the eye of the world, many, many businesses involved. New Orleans is not like that. New Orleans was founded on piracy, and you still see that in the local politics. And predominantly poor people, really, and doesn't draw the interest. After Hurricane Katrina came, they moved thousands of people who had become homeless to Houston, Texas, and created a huge homeless population in Houston that remains to this day an issue, economically, socially, politically. So support from the outside is necessary, in particularly with disasters. I want to expose you to a concept through another little short video, just a couple minutes. And this is a little news story where they're introducing to their audience the concept of first responders. Not so much first responders, everybody kind of knows what that is, but the critical incident stress management teams that have since, they're almost everywhere now. And it has become the prototype for what we're going to talk about in terms of non-military, paramilitary people leading. The people that trained me in critical incident stress management were retired firefighters. So we're going to watch a little bit of this. Give me another second here, if I can remember my sequence. I turn my camera off. I go to the tube. And we do how first responders respond. Here we go.
First responder groups on scene of that crash, and the job of a first responder, as we all know, comes with a lot of stress.
But there is a group to help. News 8's Kyle Dimke joins us now to tell us about how these first responders cope after a traumatic incident. Kyle?
Well, guys, no matter how long they've been a first responder, some calls are worse than others. The Critical Incident Stress Management Team, or the CISM, is there to help first responders get through that tough time, though.
I still today remember my first fatal fire.
Even after around 30 years as a firefighter, there are some calls that stand out in Chief Greg Cleveland's mind.
I know that if these issues are not dealt with appropriately, they can have devastating effects on individuals and their families.
To help first responders deal with the day-to-day stress and traumatic incidents they see, a special group of volunteers who are first responders themselves answer the call both day and night to help take care of their own.
It's really talking about, what were your first reactions? How are you coping with it now? What kinds of signs and symptoms are you having from stress? And then we offer them some suggestions on, how to deal with the stress.
Critical Incident Stress Management Team member Carla Epler says after a more traumatic accident, the CISM team is called in to talk.
They do a tough job, and they need to have somebody to talk to after some of these really tough calls.
And first responders say talking truly helps.
You're always going to remember this event, but we're telling you how to file it. We're helping you file it in the brain properly, so it's stored neatly, and it's not just going to all come barging out at some time.
Basically, our philosophy is if we get a call from a first responder agency or an ambulance, fire, police, we will do everything we can to get there.
The CISM is an organization around the world devoted to helping first responders. Our local team covers the entire Cooley region with members from all over the area. It's made up of first responders like police officers, firefighters, EMTs, local pastors, and social workers.
Thank you, Kyle. Members of the CISM are trained to talk with first responders.
And they also meet a few times a month to learn new techniques and role play to keep their skills up.
All right, give me a second here to pull this together. Okay, so what we saw in that video, I don't know if you caught it. It came pretty quick. He said we're helping them put the memories, store the memories in the right place. What happens in critical stress, potentially traumatic circumstances, is the brain responds with different biochemistry than in normal memory. And it is stored in a way that it can be accessed very easily. It can be accessed through a sight, through a smell, through a sound, through thinking about it. And with it come powerful emotions. So the concept of debriefing, which I'll cover with you in a few minutes, is to try to help that settle and not be quite as reactive. Timing is important. One of the big mistakes they made in New York was people were working, and they're working hard, and they're working in very difficult situations. Rescue and recovery and looking for body parts, really emotional stuff. And you have to be in a certain mindset, certain objective mindset. I call it your performance mode. And they made the mistake of pulling people out of the line of work and having them sit in small groups to debrief, causing them to examine their hearts at a time when they needed to not do that. And it actually made people sick, and some people were unable to return to work. And that was because things were happening so fast, people were not trained well enough to do this sort of thing. But we now know that you need to have time to recover in order to really think and deal with and share stories, which I'll share with you in just a minute, how that works. Oops, wrong button. And so we've talked about individual and community, and first responders are dealing with both individual and community, and the national and international, when we have world war, then we're dealing with long periods of recovery. And back to my discussion of resources available, support available, we look at the powerful nations of Germany and Japan, both economically, politically, and where they were at in 1945, 46, 47. And we look at other areas that have a disaster. Haiti had an earthquake not too long ago. Eastern Europe has never really recovered. I mean, if you go and visit Eastern Europe countries, you'll see histories of glorious political, art, wonderful things. And I don't mean to speak negatively about them at all. I have many friends in Romania, but the economic realities of going through tough times and the lack of supportive from other nations and so forth is really evident as you contrast different parts of the world. Now, fortunately, we're seeing a lot of great stuff happening in Eastern Europe, but you can see the longevity of time for recovery relative to the resources available during recovery. So when they get big enough, we call them disasters. And that's when these overwhelming events, including property, loss of life, are affecting large communities. So we call the 9/11 incident the World Trade Center disaster. We call Hurricane Katrina a disaster. We had a storm that came through my area a couple months ago, and it wasn't a disaster. The property loss is minimal, isolated to a few people. There was no loss of life. Even when a hurricane comes through our area and somebody dies, we don't call it a disaster. It is for that person, but we don't call it a community-wide disaster. So that's the term that we use for big things. And disasters can be either natural, hurricane, flood, tornado, earthquake, or man-made, acts of terror, bombs, war. And from a psychological perspective, going through the man-made ones is worse. One of the big issues of going through a disaster is the effect that it has on your sense of self and identity. And you could see this really evident when I was in New Orleans. People had literally lost all of their material goods. And I was interviewing people that had nothing. And even the clothes they wore were given to them by people from managing shelters and handing out things. So they had what they had on the shirts on their back, and some people were actually able to focus on gratitude, which is really important, grateful for life, grateful for those that, and these are even people that lost loved ones, grateful for those that survived, whereas others, through, I wouldn't say with any fault of their own, but they were focused on the loss in such a way that you could just tell, like losing family photos was such a deep loss that they felt it, very deeply, and it's kind of a hopeless thing because you can't replace those things. These are people that, this is before everything's stored in the cloud. So there are certain material losses you cannot replace, and when our identity is connected to it, it can lead to a significant state of hopelessness. So it's really important that leaders, particularly pastors, are able to guide people into hope, appropriate gratitude without being like placating or annoying, but lead people toward in a forward movement. So some of the people most vulnerable when these things happen are the most vulnerable before these things happen. So the lower economic groups, the younger groups who are dependent children, the elderly who may be dependent, the infirm, these are the people most greatly affected by every kind of disaster. And so vulnerability is a factor before, and that affects the after effect. And the other is the amount of exposure. And so if you're the people that lost everything in Hurricane Katrina, their exposure was, except for their own life, was complete. Versus going through a storm and losing your car, which you might be able to replace. The most impactful episode in my life was what happened in New York. And I had no significant relationships in New York. I'd flown out of the major airport there, both JFK and LaGuardia. But that was my only exposure to New York, was flying in and out of there all of my life until 2001. And I remember watching television and seeing these things happening and thinking, because of who I am, I would love to be able to help. I would love to be able to go there. I wish I was still in the Army because I would know what's going on. I would be able to do something. And much of the world felt that way after this thing. So a disaster will bring about a great act of charity, at least in the beginning. And so this was created actually by a group of firefighters who went up to help. And they took a picture of it, and I got a picture of it. And if you look at the content, they describe where they're from. So they're announcing that they're coming to help, and they're asking for God to help, and unity is on this thing. And that's what we saw incredibly in New York. One of the values that comes out of disaster is the realignment of our own values, at least for a while. And there's a beauty in that. In the midst of devastation, there's a beauty in the human spirit. And so what I also wanted to point out was social support is critical, and that stress brings out the best and the worst. So while you have people coming to help, you also have looting. And while you have people coming to support even fragile life, you have bad things happening, people being victimized and harmed in this sort of thing. So, but the good side is we tend to unite against a common enemy, and when that common enemy is disaster, it works well. Working in teams is really important, and understanding how your team function is important. When we went up the first time, I planned a 5-day exposure. I kind of knew inherently from my experience in training that to be up there too long could wear down our defenses and we could become harmed by it. And before we took the first trip, I contacted the Critical Incident Stress Management Foundation, long name, and they verified that. They said that they were seeing people. I went down a month, just about a month after, and that they were seeing people who had already been at ground zero for 3 weeks getting really sick. And so they said no longer than 7 days. So we had already 5 days was right. So knowing that kind of thing, doing a little research. And today it's easy to go online, contact foundations. Something happens in your community. What do we do? Someone can tell you pretty easily what to do. And so, and you work in teams because of the value of debrief, which is what we're kind of focusing on here for the next few minutes. So this is my team. The fellow to the right of the screen is a much thinner, younger version of me. And then we have a group of diverse disciplines. You'll see a uniform cap. You'll see. So this contains pastors, professors, psychologists, social workers, a musician, a handyman, and we took Spanish-speaking people. We took people of diverse ethnicity. We wanted to fit in as best we could, or to be able to send team members that could fit in as best they could. So we got an eyeful and an earful the first week we were there. I took this picture. It was a remarkable day. I think the sunlight, the timing that we were there, and so this is an image that I look at often and ponder what transpired. This is ground zero. This is the famous waffle structure to the left was in many, many images until it was finally taken down. And on that day, Dr. Richard Kidd and I were escorted in little, call them gators, little 6-wheel all-terrain devices, to go back and interface with folks who were working on the job. And that was a very sobering. It's a mix of exhilaration and sobering when you're doing this sort of thing. You're very much all in. You're very much focused. But after that, let me keep this up for a minute. So, what struck me were the smells. The sights, the sounds, the smells, but the olfactory process, the smelling mechanism, stores memory really, really well. And I actually, that night I was changing my clothes, and my shirt smelled like that. I stuffed it in a plastic bag, and I wanted to take it home to share it with people. And those that were brave enough we would just open the bag, and you get a whiff of ground zero, and you get a feel for this is what people are breathing. And actually, it's toxic. It's not good for you. So, we didn't spend much time there, but some of the people that spent a lot of time there are now sick. So I intentionally was storing a smell so I wouldn't forget, and pictures, as I showed you earlier. So those are to promote more positive kinds of experiences. What we call trauma triggers are negative kinds of experiences, where a sight of something sparks this memory that's poised, ready to come out with powerful feelings. And in a worst case scenario, you actually relive it in a hallucination kind of process, and or you dream it in a nightmare kind of process. But to any of our senses, or just hearing stories about things or looking at pictures, there were many, many people that couldn't look at an old photo of the Twin Towers after this event occurred. In fact, we had as a logo for our event, we didn't know it would be a problem. We had the Twin Towers and a symbol of faith and a man praying. And as soon as we heard somebody say, "Oh, that triggers such horrible visions," we took it off our website. We took it, we got rid of it, and we realized, okay, that's not helping people. That's hurting people. So sensitivity to these realities can help you craft ways to help people, really well. So the individual interventions, one-on-one, we did a lot of them. I did a lot of them after Katrina. I do a lot of them every year. I do bank robberies, I do death of people on job sites and that sort of thing. So it's something that I'm quite involved in. And it's really a simple process, how to help people. And I call it the head, heart, gut, head model. This is my sort of synthesizing of the training in the critical incident stress management world. And we did this. We needed to train people quickly and give them a mechanism that they could follow. So there's a linear path here: head, heart, gut, back to your head. They had to remember that. And some people actually just put this on a 3x5 card with little notes. So what the head means is you ask someone to tell what happened. Tell me your story. And when people are telling the story, they're more in their head than their heart. Unless they get overwhelmed by their emotions, then we're dealing with the heart. But most people would talk about this, and then we would take them to the heart. We would say, well, how did that feel? How has this affected you? How does this feel? Or sometimes when people were working, we wouldn't do this. We actually went to places where they were working really hard on sorting body parts, some really potentially traumatic stuff. And so I would ask about family. So how are your kids doing? And this I found has worked a lot with people. They can talk about other people without sort of disrupting their function. So I would ask, so how are your kids doing? And they would say, oh, I'm concerned about my kids. They saw this or they experienced that. And we would talk, and so I would take them through sort of a sideways approach. And so the heart is, how do you feel? And you just listen. You're using skills. If you go back to the training we did, the Good Shepherd knows his sheep, or any of the trainings on marriage or premarital counseling, we review the echo, validate, empathy dialogue. I'm not going to do it today, but you can go back and see that. It's essentially effective, active listening. And so we would listen. We listen to their story. Then we listen to their emotions, and we empathize with them. So you'll see in previous training, if it's a more factual story, you're echoing the facts. If it's a heart-wrenching story, an emotional story, you're just responding with words of empathy. You don't really worry if you get the facts straight. That was devastating. That was scary. That concerns you. So then we're listening with empathy. And then if we have time, it seems appropriate. And so we go for what I call the gut, which is, what's the worst thing that happened? Can you talk about that? Tell me what the worst thing was. And often you're getting tears or anger or tension, and we just let them express themselves. We continue to respond with empathy predominantly, just letting them listen, hearing them. And then people tend to go to calm. They've expressed their emotion. You have received it. That's the critical piece of social support. They express their experience. We receive it. And then we intentionally take them up to their head with questions like, what are you hoping for? That was a question. If I had a firefighter working at the sorting field where they were taking rubble and seeking body parts, and this firefighter would talk about his kid. The worst thing was my kid lost a friend. He had a friend in the tower, and he lost a friend. What are you hoping for? I'm hoping that I heard this a lot. I'm hoping my kids want to create a world where this doesn't happen. I'm hoping my kids appreciate the love that exists and the joy that exists in life. You hear these really wonderful expositions of things that should come out of disaster when we ask people to do that. And then mobilizing resources would involve, how do you usually cope with this? Just simple questions. What helps you when things are really rough? Well, I'm a runner. I run. Have you taken time to run? No, I haven't done that. Well, you think you could? Yeah, I probably could do that after work. It's getting your head and your plans out of the disaster into those things that will keep us going. I haven't talked to my brother yet. Yeah, I'm worried about how he's doing. Well, would you have time to call him? You think, yeah, I probably could on break. I can give him a call. Good. Why don't you do that? Because you'll be surprised if you haven't been dealing with this kind of thing, just how scattered the mind gets when these things get so intense and so very, very real and very visceral. So we simply take them through a series of questions from the head. Tell me your story. How did you feel? Or sometimes it just flows into all three levels. Can you talk about how you felt? How is that? And then it's empathy. What's the worst? It's empathy. Back to the head. What usually helps? What are the resources available? And people will often want to help as part of their own healing, and that's fine. So you want to be part of the distribution of food in this neighborhood. Yeah, once I get off work, I'm going to go do that. Great, that's awesome. That's getting you out of yourself as you do that sort of thing. So acts of charity, expressions of gratitude are huge in terms of helping people cope with the acute state of critical incidents, be it, a murder of an individual in a family affecting the church community, or a disaster affecting a larger community. So along those lines, we had individual interventions and group interventions. And we follow the same format. It's just you structure it differently to fit the circumstance. So I can talk to an individual like that. This happens to be, to the left is the pastor of this church, followed by a Virginia Beach my local police chaplain, who's also a pastor, a college professor of psychology who speaks Spanish, me, and Dr. Richard Kidd, another pastor. So we have pastors, mental health, academician, and chaplain. And in front of us is about 150 people from this church, very spontaneously brought together on a Friday night. We did a little teaching, very much like as what you're being exposed to here. And then we invite people to ask questions. And we spent an hour, and it was very moving, really powerful, as people got really honest. And I'll never forget some of these conversations. A fellow stood up and said, "I just want to go and shoot every raghead in town," referring to turbans. And so we listened and validated, "I can certainly understand your anger." And then the senior pastor very gently said, "But that's not what we're about. I appreciate you sharing your feelings, and he just kind of guided them in a simple discourse of love your neighbor, and then people were sharing how they were going to help and what they hoped to do. Very, very powerful, moving hour of sharing together with a time of worship. So that's a group intervention. We did a number of those, and I do that on a smaller scale. If there's a bank robbery, I may have a dozen people who witnessed the bank robbery, and we do this sort of thing. But it's the same process. What's the story? How do you feel? What's the worst thing? How do you mobilize resources? And so when I'm doing a bank robbery in a secular environment, I'll say to them, now, and I try to keep humor, I try to keep it reasonably light without being disrespectful. I say, some of you may ignore this, but I really want you to go home and not drink anything tonight. And then this is a secular crowd. Oh, no, I'm not going to. I said, I know, but I got to tell you this, that if you drink alcohol, it actually can make the recovery period of time longer because of what it's doing to the brain. And then they, half the group's jokingly saying, "Oh, I'm getting drunk tonight." I said, I understand, but, so it's teaching in a way they can consume it. You can't control whether they'll do it or not, but you try to present truth. And as far as, this is just an hour overview, so we can only cram so much in. But if you go online, you will see actual training that you can participate in anywhere in the world. Those of you in Romania can actually go and spend a couple hours getting a much more detailed exposure to the way they train in these sorts of things, if you want to do that. And if you find something that's really good for you, you could extend that to your community, congregation, other leaders, invite other leaders in to discuss these things, because trauma occurs in every life. I watched my mother die of cancer. It's not as traumatic as a murder because we kind of expected it, but it was really over a 2-month period of time. It was rather rapid in my life. And when she died in August of 2001, and I was standing in New York City 2 months later with my own grief filling my heart, I wept a lot with people, and it was real. In fact, that was part of what God used. One would say, "I lost my brother," and I said, "Oh, I just lost my mother." And she knew I wasn't from there, but, "Oh, you understand." And there would be an embrace and tears, and that kind of powerful connectedness comes out of our own difficult experiences and what we've learned from them. So God does not protect his people from hard times, because it is in hard times that other people are open to the gospel or new truth and knowledge, if they're believers already. And then in that openness comes a high risk factor. That openness is either open to negative or positive influences. I had the privilege of going all over 3 of the boroughs. Long Island's not New York, and Long Island. So Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Manhattan. Didn't get much of the Bronx. So 4 of the 5 boroughs and Long Island in the course of a couple of years. And there was one pastor whose story I'll never forget. There's a lot of I'll never forget stories. So I saw him several weeks after this happened. He said the churches are full. People are seeking God. And there was an optimism with that. Well, 2 years later, I saw him and he said, "I don't know if I can do this. The churches are empty." And we talked about that. And he said the need drove people to the church, but the longevity for some people, in the more distant areas, Staten Island, um, the losses were not replaceable. Even though millions of dollars flowed into New York City to help people that actually lost loved ones, it took a while to disperse. So if your primary breadwinner, your primary person with most employment dies or is disabled, you're kind of stuck for a while. Eventually, a lot of money flowed in, but there were windows of great despair. And so in one of those windows, I talked to him, and it was just really striking how he was discouraged because he was feeling helpless in the face of the what had become the economic need in his particular area. So you use the same principles in a group, head, heart, gut, head model, but this is a really important piece. We don't want to vicariously traumatize people. That's a professional term, vicarious traumatization, meaning I wasn't in it, but when I hear you tell the story, it's as if I was in it. And my trauma will not be as great as yours, but nevertheless, you can tell me a story and it traumatizes me. And that's what was happening in New York. They would pull people together that hadn't seen the same things, and they would listen to the horrible things that somebody else had been exposed to, and they'd get worse. It really works well. Let's say we've all witnessed a car accident, and it was a terrible thing. And we saw the impact, we saw blood, we saw the kind of stuff you see, and we're really shaken up by it. But if we can sit down, and this is what people naturally do in an intact society, and just talk about it. I saw this, I saw that. Just the doing that gets a little bit of the burden off. And that's if we share the same experience. We're not going to be hurt by it because we were all there anyway. We're just going to be helped. So it's very important that you don't engage people who have too much difference in exposure because you could hurt somebody. And then you proceed once you've decided. And one of the questions in training is everybody in the room that should be here, and are there people in the room that shouldn't be here? And then you describe what that is, because I don't know when I'm going into a situation what people experienced. But sometimes someone will say, he didn't really see it. I'll say, I want to talk to you later. Just move that person aside. In this group, I want the people that witnessed what happened. And then it's in a group, I just say, tell me the story. And a person will tell me a part of the story, and I'll say, does anybody have something to add? Does anybody have something to add? And if they just move into feeling mode, which often happens spontaneously, I make sure everybody has a chance to share. I don't make anybody share. Sometimes people are internal processors, they're too traumatized, and they just really can't pull it together to share in a story. But they benefit from being there, absorbing and identifying what's taking place. So the questions are not demanding. Does anyone want to share what you feel? In the beginning, I'll say, is anyone willing to? And then once we get rolling, does anyone else want to share something? I want to be sure everybody gets a chance to share. And I'll do that a couple times because some people take longer to respond. So the shifting from place to place is done with invitation, sort of like an altar call. You don't want to close it down too soon. So, an invitation, but then you move on. So we go head, heart, gut, back to the head. And it's good for people. The good thing about a group is people will hear ideas about how to cope. Well, I'm going to do this. Well, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that. That's a good idea. That's a great idea. And as a leader of the process, I am selectively reinforcing the good things with attention. And if somebody throws out the bad things, I'm going to get drunk. We just kind of, smile and just sort of wave that off. And you can kind of control the focus when you're running the group well. So group debriefing takes an understanding of the process and group skills, the ability to tell when somebody's beginning to monopolize, take over the group too much, giving everybody a chance to share, paying enough attention so you can see if somebody's being overwhelmed by something. And a team allows two people to be present, and then you can have an observer doing the observation part while you're doing the brief teaching and co-facilitating of the discussions kind of thing. And very often when I've got two people, would you mind taking this person out and just chatting a little bit alone? They seem to be dealing with something, and nobody takes offense at this. They welcome the opportunity. Then they go off for a little private time. They come back. Often they either join us or they choose not to, depending on what that was about. And so that's the outline. That is, if you have listening skills, if you have the capacity for empathy yourself, then you can hear the story, experience the emotions, from the gut, the worst part, and then get back to resources. And as a leader, so how do you prepare yourself as a leader? Well, you need to be connected to resources. You need to know where food can be found. You need to know where shelter can be found. You need to know where medical support can be found. Or you need to be connected with other leaders who would have that information, which is more how I function. I don't have a church, so I'm not primarily as responsible for people as you all are. But when my clientele are in need, I know what church to send them to based on their need, because I know people in the community, or where the free health clinics are, or where the local mission is, where they can get accommodations for the night, that sort of thing. A fire can occur in any community and people are homeless. A car crash can occur in any community and people are fatherless. So these basic tools do have application to daily life. And if you live in a dangerous environment, you're using them all the time. My friends in urban ministry who hear gunshots every night before they go to bed, they're using these tools all the time. Very, very challenging environments for some. So part of taking care of yourself is your own support. So this is my team, and we did this in the morning before we start the day. And you can see we're in prayer, but it's not just prayer. This is preparation in the morning and debriefing at night. In the morning, we talk about what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, who's going to do what, when we're going to regroup for a midday debrief, where we're going to get food. This is real important, that your team knows where to get food, where to get water, toileting facilities. And then we go about our day, and then at night we are doing the same thing. We are gathered around, we're debriefing, and so prayer is kind of either our beginning and wind up of our meeting. But in between, we're talking. What'd you experience? What'd you experience? And one that was really profound for me, and there are a bunch of them when you go into these intense environments, was I'd had a challenging day emotionally, just because of the amount of sharing that people had done. And we were all sharing, and I just started crying. And I don't cry a lot in public. And so they all just kind of got quiet, and they just let me cry for a few minutes. And then my friend Richard said, "Is there something you want to share?" And I said, "My mom, I can't share this with my mom." And they all got it. They all knew my mother had died 2 months earlier. And I didn't even know why I was crying until I just had a chance to pause and just kind of reflect. And I realized, I knew as I was doing this is one of the most both tumultuous and life-forming series of events I would go through working in this environment. I couldn't share it with my deceased mother. And so I was back in touch with my own grief. The group appropriately just helped me express. They acknowledged my feelings, and then we moved on with the meeting. And that's how this kind of thing goes. It's called debriefing. And it's a concept that was used when I was in the Army. We debriefed after certain things. And so after working in the critical environment, we debrief so that we remain healthy, whole, positively focused, grateful, kinds of things we want to lead people through. So you debrief with other leaders using the same model. There are times that we had to talk people through, they heard some horrible stories, and we had to talk them through that. And then at the end of the day, one of the things we purposefully would say, what were the good things that came out of this day? What were the hard things? And then reinforced boundaries has to do with, who's in charge is one boundary, and that's God. What can we do? In the model that I'm sharing with you, we go to this place. We're visitors. We can listen, we can advise, and we can instruct. That's it. We can't make somebody do something. We can't provide food for them. That wasn't our role, but we knew where they could get it. And so reinforcing boundaries with yourself and your team is, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do. And we're not going to try to feel guilty over what we can't do, because guilt is so common in these environments. And so the ability to adequately define your role, the role of your team, no matter what it is, death of a child in your church, which can be horrendous, because that later leads to huge marital problems. So all these critical incidents have chronic stress that goes on, and learning how to manage all this stuff is real important. And allowing for grief. Grief takes time. Grief takes just sitting there with someone while they cry and not trying to help anything, just receiving it, letting them cry. And that's what, in that little story I told, that's what my group did. So I reflected, this feeling came before the understanding. So I cried, they let me calm down. I reflected on why I was crying, and they just let it happen. They just quietly waited. So there's a lot of patience involved in doing grief work. Patience with yourself. What people tend to try to do is sidestep it. They stay busy, or they don't want to talk or think about it. But you just have to enter into grief. God gave it to us. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. It's a process. And so as I'm talking to people who are grieving, I just remind them that it's a process. I'll say, this is normal, and in time you're going to feel differently about this, and you're going to learn from it, and it will actually you'll gain some kind of strength from this process. Those are things I believe, and when I have a chance to walk it through with people, I actually see it. So I've got lots of experience being able to share stories where this is real, because when the person is hit with, like, I've lost everything, or I'm afraid of losing everything, or I've lost the most important person in my life, or I don't know what to do, the leader has to direct their mind, not manipulatively and not callously, just gentle, helping them move. And so there's this mix between, I know where I'd like to take you, I can't make you go there, I have to accept the limits of my influence, but I will try to guide you forward. And so that's what that's about. So we worked with kids in every environment I've been in, and kids need to have attention paid to them. What happened here was a box of teddy bears had been given to this particular church very close to Ground Zero, and we had the privilege of working with the children and distributing these teddy bears. So that's the light you see here. So these kids went to school within eyesight of the Twin Towers that came down. They saw this happen. You see the smile on her face? That's because she's under 7 years of age. Doesn't emotionally understand what's taking place yet. Actually, that's a protection that God gives us. So we want to get back to normal as fast as possible, at least as much as we can. Daily routines, including sleep, appetite. And so a leader, if you're taking care of yourself, you can actually intervene in people's lives and give them gentle instruction. You need to eat. You need to sleep. Let's take a walk. You need to spend time with your child. Children often get emotionally overlooked because the adults are overwhelmed. And so one of the most significant things that you can direct as a leader, if you influence a community, is seeing that other people who are not or less impacted spend time with the children of those heavily impacted. Just as you saw them, going back to the first video, the mother rat who is calmed can affect the child that isn't hers. So do other adults surrounding little children with love and care calm them, even though their parents are still freaking out someplace. It's very, very, very important. And of course, it's very difficult if the whole community's been affected. So we allow for stress recovery with lots of grace. We realize these are what leaders think and teach your people. Everybody's not going to look their best here. You're going to see some people more irritated than usual, some people more sad than usual, some people less communicative, and we have to have a little grace. So I call it the 20% grace discount. So because of the stress, you get 20% out of the ordinary behavior I'm not even going to take personally or bother with. And if it's a big enough disaster, that has to be bigger, to where you're almost 90% grace discount for what you're seeing. So lots of understanding and the hope of wisdom coming out of bad stuff. I have that. One advantage that I have is having worked for as long as I have, going on 40 years in the field, and experienced enough stuff myself with just evidence of God's and God's people help. That just helps craft a perspective that I have and that I can share with others. Now, this last piece is really important. It's tempting if you're a community leader, if you're a pastor, to let it take over your life, and that's what I saw the first time. The churches down at Ground Zero, their lives became absolutely absorbed with it, and it's understandable. But what I saw a few years later, a huge superstorm came through called Hurricane Sandy, and it wiped out miles and miles and miles of homes up in the same area. But some leaders, some denominations in particular, were training leaders from lessons learned over the previous 15 years, 11 years. This was 2012, 11 years. And so they had leaders prepared to manage their time and resources. So they didn't just abandon normal church. I visited a church in particular on, where was it? It was on Staten Island, which was greatly affected by Hurricane Sandy. It happened to be up in a high dry spot. But what they did was they partnered with Samaritan's Purse. They had dry parking lots, so there were Samaritan's Purse vehicles there distributing goods. They organized their gym, but all they gave were a portion of the parking lot and the gym. They kept the rest of the church for church, and they continued normal services, which the community desperately needed. And that contrasted to what I saw in some environments where the magnitude of the event seemed to overtake everything. And it took a long time to get back to normal. So the leader, the effective leader, preserves him or herself and and our organizations as best we can while engaging in the disaster recovery or critical incident stress recovery. So this is a drawing just to give you a sample of working with children. And we will stop. I realize I'm out of time. The picture is obvious. They were given a blank sheet of paper with the phrase "something terrible happened in my life," and just doing this was helpful for these kids. Just being able to, I don't know if you can see, but there's a yellow plane, and "ha ha" is a cartoon blurb. So the plane has gone through. The terrorists are enjoying it, and there's death and devastation. And so this child drew this picture and felt good about giving it to the leader and sharing her feelings. So we use play where words are hard. So to wrap this up, I think we've kind of touched on this stuff. So resources. What am my other slide? Online resources. We'll post this online. We have the videos you watched, and you can watch other TED Talks. Go to YouTube, TED Talk, put in whatever topic you want. And there's some really good training in critical stress. You can go to my counseling center website for more training. And just to remind you all, we exist to help leaders develop. So there's face-to-face, online, phone communication. You can email me if you like. If you want to reach me at pvanvalin@edencounseling.com or go through Mirabella, I've got hers posted there. If you have questions about this, you want more resources, just talk to us. We're happy to do that. We do intensives for leaders here. We go to on-site for training. So these are things that you have at your disposal because you're our friends. So thank you for joining us. I pray that your day does not have any disasters, but that you are maybe a little bit more ready if it does. Take care. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.